Hi, Ted and John. Hopefully, all is well with both of you. I wanted to take this time to send you another update email on kind of the state of the union with all your boats, engines, and all the fun stuff in your lives. Um, I know these probably are more longer or more drawn out than they need to be, I guess. It just makes sense to hopefully this makes it a little clearer for everyone. It's a lot easier for us to keep track of everything, and especially when we have multiple eyes looking at the same video, there's no confusion for anything. So I ask you both just to bear with me, grab a coffee or a drink while you watch this video, and hopefully we can come to kind of some meaningful conclusions on things that need decisions. So the first thing that we'll, I guess, start with is Big Bird or Ted's motor. Not because he's more important, or maybe because he is more important, just because you both are equally important, but just because it's kind of a little bit more simple, and some of the stuff that we're going to talk about will affect some of the later stuff in this kind of list. So we got the motor apart and we inspected everything, measured stuff, cleaned everything, and according to what you suggested with the options for what we were doing there. One thing that we did notice, which is a little bit odd, is the pistons that are in the engine are not the ones that are original to the serial number of the engine. So these should have top pin pistons based on your serial number. So it's a newer block. I think it was made in 2000. It should have top pin pistons, but you actually had side pin pistons in it, which are undesirable. This is the pin that I'm referring to when I'm talking about that. Apologies if I'm patronizing you, but I might as well explain this. Initially, Mercury had these pin features where they actually press an iron pin into the piston to hold the rings in. And this is the ring end gap goes around here. These pins actually fell out quite a lot and caused the motor to blow up in a very spectacular way when they're side pin, because they're quite short and there's not a lot of friction that's holding them in. So then what they did is they actually pushed it in from the top of the piston to make it a lot longer. You can actually see it comes through the side of the piston here, and they stake it, so basically that eliminated that reliability problem. Everyone uses top pin pistons unless it's an original piston to the motor, but your motor was new enough that it should have had top pin pistons in it. So at one point someone took them out. So this is kind of one of the things that now we're at a crossroads. Do we put it back together with the same pistons and just put fresh rings in it, or upgrade to a top pin piston? So the pistons, you can see that were in the engine, in the wear indication on the actual skirt. You can kind of see there's some shininess, but they're totally still usable. They haven't collapsed when you look at the measurements on them. They're still totally usable. So we have lots of good used race pistons, a top pin one here, and then ones that have some CNC cutting on the edges of the skirt, which allow more flow to go into the transfer ports. So the decision that needs to get made here is, do you want us to put the same pistons back in, or for an additional $200 we can put kind of a stock single ring piston into it that is top pinned, or one of the modified sets for 600. This isn't per piston, this is for the whole set. If you wanted to put brand new pistons in, obviously the cost goes up a lot. So that's why we were suggesting these used pistons here, especially because the nick on the motor isn't fresh, but it's pretty minty. So yeah, this is what we would recommend. Realistically, the biggest thing here is we were thinking a little bit, and this is going to be Ted's best boat, and especially if you want to race down in the States in a compression limited class, even in a non-compression limited class, the single ring is going to allow the motor to rev out a lot more. With a dual ring setup, you're pretty much going to hit a brick wall at like 9,500 RPM. It won't really rev much past that. I know, and you say to yourself, well, okay, I don't really want to rev that much higher than that anyways, but to go from 9 to 95 is going to take a while, just because that second ring will eat up a lot of friction. So it's a double-edged sword. Going to a single ring piston, obviously it's kind of free horsepower, so to speak, especially when the motor's revving higher, if you can raise the compression and all the things that these mod motors have. So yeah, that's definitely a good upgrade. So we would recommend it for this. But the only downside is you kind of get half the rebuild life, because there's only one ring as a wear surface. So some food for thought there. I wouldn't recommend putting the same pistons back in if you're going to beat the hell out of the motor, which I know you guys will. So the side pin piston, eventually you're going to have an issue with that. If you the margin of overheating it is very, very small before you basically blow it up. So that that's just some food for thought. The used piston sets, we have many of them, but they're all in better shape than the pistons you currently have. So there's a decision there for Ted. Another decision for Ted is when we pulled the intake off, you have 5-pedal reeds, which is good for this type of drag application, but they're just plastic reeds, and you can see kind of how they seal here on the edges where they're contacting the rubber coating on the cages. This is fine. There's nothing wrong with them, but for more performance, a stiffer reed is actually better, and the throttle response will be better in drag racing, and they're actually lighter and they'll rev a lot higher, these carbon reeds. So that's another upgrade you can do. The cages that you have in the engine are kind of not optimal either. If you're going to go with this 5-pedal cage, I'll zoom in a lot here because this detail is pretty hard to see, but on... Actually, this is a lot easier. Your cage looks like this, and the 2 reeds at either end have this divider to kind of stiffen it, and it doesn't really do anything. There's no stiffness that's required there, but this divider kind of hurts the flow a little bit. So they made later cages that never had that divider, and also the round blunt edge here. We have ones that are cut with a specific angle to give you better flow as the reed open and closes, and it's a sharper knife edge there. So that's an upgrade that's $400 with the reeds to swap over the cages, and you'd keep your stuff. So same thing with the pistons here. You get to keep these. I don't know what you use them for, but you could keep them and use them in a lower horsepower motor that's not going to rev very high. But the reason why you might say, okay, well, that's not that much money for the piston upgrade. The reason being is we quoted you before on 2 rings, each set of ring on the end. So the motor has 12 rings when it's dual ring. It's about $900, so $450 for a set of 6. So technically you're saving $450 on the rings. That's kind of why, because you're only using a single ring in this setup. If you wanted a dual ring piston, we could look at that as well, but it's going to be more expensive. The piston won't change, but you're going to add about another $450 on the ring itself. And we don't really ever have pistons with this type of CNC cutting to get the flow on the skirt a lot better. So you can see the rounded edge here, how much extra area you have that's not shrouding the inlet of the transfer port. Anyways, probably more detail than you wanted to know. But those are two decisions there that Ted needs to make. That kind of summarizes everything for the status of this engine here. Yeah, we're pretty much ready to put it back together. Everything's clean, measured. All the fuel system's been flow tested, and all of that stuff ready to go back together. The next engine is the 280 rebuild that we kind of built up as a stock motor for Big Red. John, you went with option B there, and we've completed that motor entirely, and this was the price there. Pretty much no changes to the quoted value that we gave you. Everything's exactly as is. Everything went back together beautifully. All the measurements check out and everything. You did have 2 pistons here that had the same issue with being side pins. So you had a box of 10 pistons, I think you brought, probably because the motor that you took them from may have been two holes might have been blown up, which makes sense because that's why these had sleeves put in the first place. But we had to donate a matching set of 2 to make this a complete set of 6, so that you have 6 matching pistons. Basically, you had 4 top pin pistons and 4 side pin pistons in that set that you brought in, or you were missing 2 effectively. So just for those 2 pistons, because you already paid for the rings, it's $100. So it's kind of like 1/3 of what this is. So that hopefully is a fair exchange there. A lot of the stuff that you don't see behind the scenes is if there's a bearing or a wrist pin in a used set that doesn't work, or it doesn't look, let's say, when we look at it under a magnifying glass, there might be some issue or some uneven wear. We replace it with pretty much the best used part that we can exchange at no cost. This happens for both you and Ted in general. Obviously, a new part is a new part, but a used part, if we notice one or two things that need to get changed, we just do that at no cost. That's kind of the benefit of this type of thing. With building engines this old, it's partially you need to have a stockpile of used parts. Otherwise, you're never having a full matching set of stuff for instances exactly like this. So that's pretty much all I will say on this engine. This will probably be about 330 horsepower and rev 8600 RPM. You can see the rods on these are the same as the rods that Ted had in his 280. It's a 280 high perf rod, and they're good for 9 or 10,000 RPM, depending on how long you use it for at that RPM and how rough the water is. So yeah, that describes this one. Like I said, no changes to the quote other than that extra $100 for the piston. So that one's completed and we're ready to bolt it on Big Red. And I will talk about that a little bit more at the end. The spare motor for Top Gun, you can see it all apart on the bench here. That is also totally completed. No changes to the quote here. Everything went back together, all the parts, because we had it all apart on the table before we quoted you. That's all good. Went back together for option B there. That's really the only thing you have to pay for on that particular boat setup. So I kind of started a little tabular list here to show the boat, the class, the engine, the mid, lower, and the labor, what you've paid and what you haven't, or what you already owned, I guess. So yeah, that's Top Gun spare. Everything went back together okay, so you can pay for that with the rest of the stuff. Now is where things get a little bit more complicated. Alex finished putting all the sleeves in and we're ready to go there, build the motor up and dyno it. So I'll go through a really detailed quote on this for you. The reason being is this is kind of the most new you could build one of these motors. It has all new components. The block is a donor block, the crank is a donor crank. But pretty much other than that, every other component is new. The rods are also used, but really low hour. So it's typical. You might come from the automotive world and say, well, how come it all can't be new? It could. Those parts are really cost prohibitive, and honestly, through racing over so many years, those particular components are not really wear items unless you have a severe failure. And there's ways that you can non-destructively test those things. So everything, in terms of the block, the crank, and the rods, those are all like reliable used units. And the crank you actually brought. So the block and the crank, obviously, there's no charge for that because it belonged to you already. Here's a list of parts, a flywheel, an SVS, the rods, brand new pistons. You're going to have brand new injectors, brand new electrical components, brand new stator, trigger, flywheel, switch boxes, coils, all of it. The coil harness, everything is going to be new. Brand new engine bearings, brand new engine bearings for the crankshaft side of the pistons or of the connecting rods and the piston pin side of the connecting rod. So pretty much as new as you can get. In order to save some costs and not make this a number that's going to scare anyone away, because the number is quite high for the quote, you do have actually very good reeds that you brought in a Ziploc bag here. You have a nice 7-pedal reed, which for this will work well. We actually make this SVS. It looks like an SVS, and probably there's some copyright infringement with the naming here, but we make this on a CNC with Alex and one of his machinists. It has larger venturis here for the actual throttle body or the individual throttle velocity stacks here. So these reeds will actually work quite well with the larger plenum here. So it's more expensive than the one that you can, a used one that you can get online. Those kind of are about half the price. Obviously, this is a brand new unit. It's a brand new intake, the SVS, and it is different. It basically adds, once you get to the 390 horsepower range, it allows you to break through the 400 range. This is one of those mods. You're choked on the intake side quite a bit if you don't do this. So highly recommend that. As far as the numbers go, I'll talk about that in the next slide, but the connecting rods that we're selecting for this, they're all tested and measured used units that we had from racing. You can see here a list of all the connecting rods that Mercury's made. So I actually went through and weighed them all, and the mass of the rods that won't work for the engine, you basically can only spin 7,500 RPM with a stock 200 rod. The 280 rod that you have in the other motors, they're actually quite good in terms of flow characteristics and mass. But if you're going to really run the motor like 10,000, 11,000 RPM, you want to have something that's beefier. So this one is the best balance of, this is a CNC cut on the Mercury heavy duty rod. So this is what this motor is going to get, or what we would recommend. We work with a gentleman in Sweden that actually makes these H-beam rods, which are really expensive. They work well for high RPM. They're a little bit heavier. We wouldn't recommend them for a drag racing engine, partially because you don't need that extra insurance of the stiffness and the strength. This is actually strong enough to go 11,000 RPM for drag racing, and they're a little bit heavier, but they also block the flow of the air going through the crankcase. So it's a little bit harder to make power with these rods versus some of the other ones. Not by a large margin, but to save some money in this build, these are the rods that we would suggest. Either of these two would work, but these are the ones that we would suggest. So yeah, let's get to the numbers. So as far as all the block and the rotating assembly goes, you can probably zoom in or see on the video if you pause it what each line item is. I went through and put part numbers for all of this. So this is basically rebuilding one of these engines from brand new. Like I said, the only things that are used are the block, the crank, and the rods. So $7,500 for the sleeves, the port work, all the case modifications, the cooling modifications that Alex does, and all of the porting in the exhaust, everything to convert it to a 400 plus horsepower engine. That's $7,500. And then the balance of that, you have 1585 in pistons, 445 in rings. Once again, a single ring. These are brand new. Connecting rods, like I said, those are used, 950. And then the bearings are about another $550. So 11,000 approximately in total for all of the rotating assembly stuff. Gaskets are pretty standard. Those are 721 for all brand new gaskets. The intake system, the SVS, that's the larger one that we custom make. That's $2,750. So it is expensive, but it's definitely something you need to uncork that last 20 horsepower. Drag cylinder heads with custom domes. You have a 280 you had two 280 sets of cylinder heads. One of them was damaged from the blow up. Those aren't usable. But the other ones went on your stock 280 rebuild. So we need a set of drag heads for this. So that's $1,500. The billet flywheel's $1,500. So pretty much all brand new electrical is $3,104. The only thing that they don't make anymore is the actual engine harness, which we have really good used ones for $250. So that will save a little bit there. The fuel system, to push this over the 400 plus mark, we're recommending the 85 fuel system conversion that we were talking about with Ted's motor, that he elected to kind of wait and see for a season or add it on in the future. You could also add it on to this. You don't have any injectors for this engine, so we have to put a fuel system in it basically. So you need a rail, a regulator, and injectors. So that's $1,250 for the fuel system stuff, $300 for a regulator. The ECU is the same. This one's going to be basically the hottest ECU that we have. It's a Bricado ECU inside a Mercury housing. And this is something we custom made back, 10 years ago now. But it's a brand new ECU that it'll be custom mapped, obviously, for the whole setup with dyno sheets and all of that. The labor's $1,200. We're kind of discounting that because we can appreciate how heavy the costs are and all of this stuff. The other thing that we're going to be doing, we'll be assembling this on the dyno, or to dyno with Alex Ledin. And we're doing that and kind of donating all the dyno time for free. So you're going to get a turnkey package that makes the most power that Alex has ever made on the dyno, basically, for this price. And that's part of us showing support for you and both you and Ted. And this is going to be the most badass motor that you guys have. So yeah, the cost is expensive. Most of it is the parts that are involved. That's kind of the name of the game with these types of engines. But yeah, the total there is just over 25 grand for the parts. Really, the only stuff that you brought that was usable was the crank and the block, and the block needed sleeves put in. So that's partially why this engine is expensive. But now you have a good idea of what it costs to get a power head pretty much brand new from the ground up. So yeah, you can feel free to pause the screen here and look at this in detail. If you have any questions or you want to see to be more budget conscious where you can remove stuff without really sacrificing power or longevity, we can talk about that for sure. So obviously this is your best motor, so I'm gonna recommend doing what you see on the screen here. So yeah, moving on now. Wild Thing, or the new Wild Thing, which is your white Comp SS. We've swapped over the brand new mid that we originally had on your red, the original Wild Thing. The reason being is this is going to be a modified boat that's 1,400 pounds. We haven't weighed it yet because we're still rigging it. But we have the motor and the gear case and everything on the boat. The steering's done. The dash, we've put this carbon fiber. We've deleted all the gauges. It's carbon dash now with an aim system. And we are going to... this is the short ram trim. It's 24 volt. We took the Braille batteries out of the red Wild Thing, the original Wild Thing, and we put them in this. So we're just finishing up the fuel system and stuff. And the tank that you originally had in Gold Rush, we put a larger tank in that for lake running. That tank, we actually inspected it and pressure tested it. It worked really good and fits well in this boat. So we're putting the fuel system all together for that setup. So you've basically paid for everything here. The motor that you got on this, a little bit of details. This is pretty much built like the Alex Ledden sleeve motor that you're getting right now. It's got the amazing rods. It's obviously got the an SVS. It's not the same. It's not the big bore SVS, but it's an SVS with the flywheel and single ring pistons. So this motor is good for 10,000 plus RPM with a really good drag ECU, which you already have. So you've paid for all of that. The only thing that's left is the labor and the rigging. So the parts that went into rigging the boat and stuff like that. So update on that there. Speaking of Big Red, I want to confirm now the configuration of this boat. The midsection, obviously we took the midsection off now, so this boat doesn't have a mid. The motor's complete, like I mentioned in one of the earlier slides. We do have a mid that came from the boat that had the XR6 case. I forgot to mention that this has the XR6 case that you've already purchased, the Swepskeg 15-inch XR6. So the mid that had, we're willing to give it to you for $5,900 plus HST. And that's a long ran mid, which is good since this is a more lake oriented boat for lake racer. And the motor, you owe this amount, which is basically the quoted value plus the $100 for the two pistons. You need still the midsection, and then we need to decide on which gear case you want to use. I know you said that you wanted to keep the polished one as a spare, but obviously that'll work for this boat. It depends on what you want. If you want us to source another one, we can do that. We don't have any more. We do have another Sportmaster, but it's not a Swepskeg. So yeah, we'll figure that out. And the other thing is we need to balance between this and the newer boat that you got, which is the XR 2002 that you're calling, I forget now, where is it? The Rocket, this one. We'll get there in a second. So we need to make a decision on the gear case that's going on this boat. Obviously, if you want to keep this polished one as a spare, you already paid for it. That's not a big deal, but we need to source another one. So just let us know on that. And obviously on the 5900, if you're okay with that for the midsection, then we can get going, bolting all that together since the motor's ready to go. For Gold Rush, I don't have a picture, an up-to-date picture of the gear case that you already paid for on that, but the motor, the gear case, and the mid are all ready to go. The fuel system is done on this. You've partially paid for a lot of this stuff. You've paid for the engine already. You've paid for the mid. You've paid for the lower. The labor and the rigging you've partially paid for. The cowling we haven't swapped over yet. but you still need to pay for that cowling. I know you brought one, but yeah, depending on what we're gonna do there, we need to figure that out. But yeah, this is nearing completion on this boat, but this is all the parts you need, so no real decisions to get made here. Just waiting on us to finish the rigging process, and then I guess payment and testing and all of that. For Fish Finder, now we're getting into the stuff that we're still waiting on parts where we've made decisions, and some of the stuff that the newer boat that you bought, we need to make a few decisions. So the Fish Finder boat, we still haven't sourced a 300X for you. The one that we had from a customer that came in honestly was a lot rougher in condition than we would feel comfortable with putting on this boat, and it's just not cost effective. By the time you rebuild all the stuff that needs to get rebuilt, and put a Mattify can and shorten the drive shaft and all of that, it wouldn't have made it cost effective, to be honest. So we're still trying to source you one for this. We have all the steering, the jack plate, and all that stuff in. We're just waiting on the engine package now. The other thing that we need for the helm on the steering, we have the steering on the engine side done, but for the helm, we still need that measurement for the center steer dimension on from, I guess this was Agent Orange, because that was a center or slightly offset center steer, XB 2003. So yeah, this is a picture of Agent Orange. This Simrad was from Agent Orange. So yeah, that is from that boat. We could put Simrad with the Fish Finder that you actually had in this boat here, Big Red. If you want us to put that into this boat similarly, obviously it's a Mercury engine, so you're not going to get the same data on the screen, but we could do that in the same location if you want. Just let us know what you're feeling with that, because you obviously own that Simrad that was in Big Red, and this was getting an AIM system, so not really that necessary, especially for this type of motor. It's not going to tell you very much. Yeah, so that's Fish Finder. Then we have the rocket that you recently built. The intention for this is a Formula Class boat. You expressed interest in a 200 FF or 225 Pro Max, probably with a 15-inch offshore and a 15-inch swept skeg Sportmaster. So all of this stuff I've left as TBD here at the top. The reason being is there's kind of a nuance in the rules. I don't know if this is, I've petitioned to have some of it changed and be made more clear. But in the Formula Class rules, the way that it's worded is it says 150, 200, and 225 Pro Max qualifies but must retain the factory rev limit, which is 6,750 RPM or 7,100 hard limit. But if you just have a regular 150 or a regular 200 that isn't a Pro Max, it basically says that you're allowed to remove the rev limiter. So see reference 5C. So the only difference really between a Pro Max and a non-Pro Max is the rev limiter. So that's kind of odd that it's written like this. So we should gain some clarity on what this means. But if we do have a 225 Pro Max that we could put on this for you, we don't have a mid, and we obviously we're short on lower units as well. So if we could source that stuff, definitely. We do have a 20-inch offshore, similar to what you have on Chantel's boat. Yeah, that's an option too, but it really depends on what you decide with this. Obviously, we don't have this boat in our possession, so planning this is really the level at which I'm asking for your input on this boat, or we're asking for your input. So just some food for thought there. The engines are easy for us. The mids slightly harder. The gear cases are probably the hardest. So yeah, that is the situation there. And then I guess just to summarize for Ted, the only thing that decisions or payments that need to get made there are the $2,730 for the engine rebuild and whatever upgrades you want to do on top of that. So choose the piston that you wanted and choose if you want us to upgrade to the carbon reeds with the modified reed cages. And we can work on everything collectively when you guys decide that you want to come and pay, or however we're going to do that, to see what we can charge HST on and what we can do cash. So yeah, just I think that's the last slide here. apologies. I know that that's quite long. I don't know how we're 29 minutes into this already, but if you have any questions, obviously that's what we're here for. It's like I said, it's been a pleasure. It's a really complex setup you guys have with this many boats and this many classes, but it's definitely something to be revered. The passion you guys have for the sport, my brother and I both really admire it, and I'd like to thank my brother. Obviously, I'm the one that's talking right now, but he prepared most of this stuff, so yeah, it makes it a lot easier when we look at the big picture a little bit like this. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. If we don't see you before Christmas, Merry Christmas to both you and your family. Thank you again for your show of support this year and everything with the Gravenhurst event. Every day I think about that, or we all do actually, and it means a lot to what you guys have done and how much you respected our family and the fact that you're ambassadors to the sport and pretty much boating in general is very it's humbling. So thank you guys, and look forward to hearing from you soon. Let us know. We'll be in the shop all next week most likely, or either us or Andre will be around, so feel free to give us a call, send us an email, whatever you need to get some of this stuff sorted out. But yeah, thanks. Signing off, and have a good weekend.